start so we have enough time to fit in everything. I'll call to order the Public Safety Committee. The Anchorage Assembly is also a committee of the whole, so all Assembly members are welcome, which will be July 12th at just after 11 o'clock. Let's start with introductions.
Suzanne LaFrance.
John Weddleton.
Forrest Dunbar.
Eric Croft.
Dick Trainee.
Christopher Constant.
Pete Peterson.
Amy Tomasky.
Dennis LeBlanc with Fire Department. Eric Shedeman with Fire Department.
Sean Case, Police. Justin Dolly B.
And in the back, hey Dean. No.
Oh, Laura Martin there.
Yeah, I'm most part of the Air Community Council.
Debbie Kelly Committee.
Jackie is on public video.
That's everybody who wants to introduce themselves. So the two issues on the agenda, and I apologize that the agenda is not very descriptive. It says who's speaking, but not much about what. In general, and we'll let them do it, but I've asked the fire department to be here to talk about opiate and spice-related calls, the numbers, what they're seeing, and then APD to both update us on data. The first official meeting with now Chief Dahl, and so that's sort of a general data update that Sean Case may handle, but also then a spotlight on property crimes, automobile crimes, and with an idea that there is possible, there's at least logically and maybe in evidence-based a link between the two. That is the rise that we're seeing in opiate-related incidents and the property crimes that seem to want that kind of money, that it may be people who need to get $100 for a fix very quickly who are doing something. And so exploring both these two things and whether they're related or not and how we're going to propose to handle them. So we'll start with APD, and Chief Dahl, you can handle it however you want, or you or Sergeant Case. Captain Case is going to start.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. I agree. We do have a presentation I'd kind of like to go through that kind of gives some what I would call baseline data for APD, kind of volume of what we do on a regular basis, and then also some specifics, like you mentioned, sir, about vehicle theft, and then also an example of kind of how we're trying to use the data that we do have to look at problems in different neighborhoods and then come up with solutions. So I'm going to let Captain Case run through most of it. He does a significant part of our review of the data we have internally.
I'm going to stand up and move, so I hope you guys don't mind. And then I can see everyone as well. So with the presentation that you're going to see today, obviously we picked and choose some of the data that we have. The police department, like most government entities, have mounds and mounds of data. Some of them we don't even know how we can retrieve after we capture it. And so we picked out what kind of some of the stuff that was similar we've given you in the past, but also some additional data and kind of give you a little bit of insight on where we're kind of going here in the future. Keep in mind that the police department's always willing to share information with you folks and give you updates on where we're at. But if we get from month to month, if we go too far right and left to where we are in center, that takes a substantial amount of time to find that data if it's not something we're used to looking at or looking for. So when you go through it, if you have things that you want to see in the future, let us know. And we'll kind of start looking at that data now instead of a week before the next meeting or whatever. And then please feel free to interrupt me anytime and ask questions on the slides that we have. And of course, it's probably not going to work. All right. There we go. So unless the slide tells you otherwise, this data is through June 21st. We usually have about a 14-day time lapse between data coming into the department and us scrubbing that data to make sure that it's actually verified. So this is 21 days, but some of the slides go further than that. So right now we're at over 20,000 calls for service for the month of June. Once we get all that data entered in there, we should be somewhere around the 22,000, which is where we kind of expect to be on a month-to-month basis. Maybe a little bit higher because June, July, August tend to be higher months. 641 arrests, Now, we have looked at data in the past, maybe even presented to this body. We would look at arrests, showing you things like how many of those arrests are repeat offenders for that particular month. So, maybe 641 arrests, and we can tell you that 90 of them are repeat offenders. Takes a little more time, but that's something that we can kind of present in the slides so you can have an idea of.
You guys can just go ahead and interrupt him and see if I did.
Just a question, so when you have a call for service, does that mean an officer responded?
Not always. It depends what the calls for service are. So I'll use one of our hot button topics of CAPSA or the ARM right now. So when we get a call that is not in our police service area, we will load a call for service so we have a record of it. And then when that call gets transferred to Department of Public Safety, we'll close that call out. That'll be captured in this data. That is every call that comes in.
So what if, someone stole my bicycle and you say, okay, yeah, that really stinks, go here and file a report online? Would that count?
No.
So that
Filing
would not
report
be a
online
call for you?
shouldn't, unless you know different.
It depends on exactly how that happens, but if it comes into the dispatch center and they refer it that way, probably not, but then it would be captured as a new report filed online, and so that would be captured in our data as far as a new case number assigned and so forth.
So dispatch makes that decision. I
They do.
call in, my bicycle was stolen, they say file a report online, never gets to
It may not ever get to the police officer.
Correct. And if somebody calls directly into records, it definitely isn't captured as a call for service because they don't kick it up to dispatch to enter it and back down to records.
We have chair training and then Mr. Dunbar.
Have you seen the impact on the SB 91 yet? Because they've changed now what you can prosecute for. So the crime's going up because of it? Because the people know they can't get charged with the crime.
So that's a very long answer, sir.
Okay. Send it to me in writing.
And
Well,
I would.
Tell you the short answer is yes.
Yeah, I'll tell you the short answer. So the short answer is SB 91 is a piece of the changing landscape. There are a couple things that are all happening at the same time. As we know, SB 91 comes into play. We changed the laws, and that was step one of about 3 or 4 steps that are taking place on kind of the spirit of SB 91. Some of the things that we haven't seen yet with SB 91 is the treatment, the opportunity to divert folks into treatment. So if we're not putting them in prison, what are we doing with them? That option isn't there yet for us. We just don't have the infrastructure for that, although the state is working on that, I've been told. The other thing is the bail schedule, and that's really important for everyone to understand. The bail schedule probably impacts the police department directly every day, more so than SB 91, because that changes the way that we make the decision on who do we take to jail and who we don't take to jail. So we
How
go.
did that change?
So a year ago, let's say, because I don't know the exact date, but we'll say a year ago, if we had somebody to be arrested for what would be considered a minor offense like disorderly conduct at 2 o'clock in the morning on 4th Avenue, when kind of the bar scene's hopping, and they're out of control, they're causing a disturbance, we get a call, we have contact with that person, they're highly intoxicated, we can put those folks in handcuffs, we can take them to jail, we can book them in under that disorderly conduct offense, and they're going to stay there until a sober person can come pick them up, so we know that they're cared for, or until they sober up. That was removed from the bail schedule. We don't have that ability to do that anymore.
But
so that
he's
means
asking how, what, who did that?
that's it. So the bail schedule is set by the 4 presiding judges throughout the state of Alaska, and what their feedback to us is that they don't believe they have the legal authority for that to be a condition of release on a bail schedule anymore. We've been doing it probably for 20 years, so that's an issue.
Is that your question?
Yes.
And just following up on his, and then I have Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Constant. Do you have suspects now, the people you catch doing stuff that in effect say, I'm going to be out for your shift, so that is that they know that this is not punishable?
No, I would say that it's more so give me my ticket so I can move on. Less than I'll be out before you finish your report.
It's not even in, I'm never going to be in.
Right,
Just give it to
right.
me.
Where we see that the most, I think that impacts us as a municipality the most is we have contact with folks that are involved in drug offenses. And typically what we can do is they can provide us information, and that information can be used to try to find the dealer and the distributor, that sort of thing. Now, they look at us and say, well, I'm not going to help you out, I'm not going to provide you with information because all you're going to give me is a ticket anyway. It does me no good to help the police department. So that's one of the areas where we see that impact.
Chair training gets privilege of the chair.
Thank you. One quick question. I get calls from business owners complaining about shoplifters. Used to be we could take shoplifters away, but now they're not even prosecuting them anymore. It's like open season on their merchandise. Because of SB 91, or is that?
So we have the theft 250 and below,
Okay.
and there is, with one of the problems with SB 91 is there's a lot of confusion when that first came out, and it wasn't just the police, but also the prosecutors, and kind of how this all goes into effect and how it impacts each of the agencies that are involved. And the way it's written is on the third offense of under 250, that becomes a more serious criminal offense. And
What
this-
about your second offense?
No, it's just a ticket. It's just a ticket. It's an infraction citation. They get a ticket and they go on their way.
That's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Dunbar, yeah.
Thank you for bringing up the bail schedule. It's, that happened 6 months before SB 91. There's a lot of rhetoric, people claiming SB 91 was actually a bail schedule done by the judges. Anyway, some people making political hay at SB 91. But, so, my question is, these numbers, 20,800, 641, I don't really have a frame of reference of whether those are high or low, you know what I mean? And I saw later on in here you guys have a 5-year average for one of your charts. Are you able to provide those when you provide these kind of numbers?
Yes.
Or could we, in future briefings, could we have, when you give us one of these numbers, just say, here's the 5-year average, so we have a sense of whether it's higher or lower? I really
That
appreciate
particular
that.
one we can do, yes.
Yeah, okay, great. And I know that you have some limitations on the data, but I appreciate that. The other thing is this wait time for 911 calls coming down to 8.3 seconds. How do you define wait time? So does that mean in 8.3 seconds you're actually talking to somebody that's going to respond to you? Or does that mean you talk to the initial person, maybe they're going to transfer you to somebody else?
So call comes in the dispatch center. When it's a 911 call, those calls take priority. And the call taker who answers the call is the one that puts that information in the computer system. That's your time frame. From the time you pick up the phone call and dial the numbers to the time someone picks it up and starts talking to you.
An actual person that could send a police officer your way.
Comes into a call taker, they are typing into the system as the person's on the phone with them, and typically what happens is once they get basic information, like what are you calling about and where are you at, they'll start sending that to the dispatcher, so they don't have to enter every single piece of information before they send it. They'll send it, dispatcher sends officers, that call taker's still in line, updating and feeding information as it goes.
Great, thank you.
Why is that, excuse me, why do you think that number is down?
So that's an anomaly. Right now, that number, our average time is about 10.5 seconds if you go over the last several quarters. And dispatch is one of our few units that we can almost to a T predict how many folks are going to be working around the clock when we take into consideration annual leave and other sorts of leave that are not considered annual vacation time. Right now, we have a few more folks in the room because we don't have some of those other leaves like family medical leave, qualifying things like that. And so our numbers are a little bit higher. So we anticipate that number is probably going to go back up to around 10.5-ish, that average is going to be. We have right now a hiring process going on for new dispatchers. That is a long process. Sometimes, some cases, the hiring process and the training for dispatchers has been known to take longer than officers, believe it or not. So we're going to see that number come up, but then we should see that number go back down once those new people are hired, trained, and then put solo on.
Mr. Constant.
Yep, so I want to make a little more hay about SB 91. You were very diplomatic in your statement that the state is taking on providing those services, treatment services. I just want to give a report from the field. In fact, they're not. They're doing just the opposite. This year they have cut the treatment services. And so while the promise of SB 91 was we're going to release these folks into community-based services and support, that we're going to increase, they haven't, and in fact they've cut it. So the non-diplomatic answer is the state's hanging themselves dry.
There you go. No comment. And that's why.
It was very good.
What are you seeing? I'll just flat out say it. I think SB 91 is the worst piece of legislation we've ever seen. It's kind of a turd wrapped in a turd sandwich. But what have you seen when it comes to, okay, originally they took 60 Class C felonies, reclassified them as misdemeanors. Effectively, that's what you're talking about, where before you could arrest them, now you just give them a ticket. But what about, it's on just the bail schedule, because there was something in SB 91 where if people couldn't afford bail within a certain period of time, they were let out.
So you may be talking about what happens January 1st, 2018, which we're involved in. Right now we're in the process of determining the pre-assessment tool, which we just got that given to us a couple weeks ago. And so basically what that does is by January 1st, 2018, people coming into the facility in DOC will have to be assessed by arraignment the next morning. And that limits, SB 91 does limit what the judges can do on bail because they have to go with the recommendations. I will tell you that there is significant issues with that assessment tool. SB 91's clear what that tool is going to look like. It is going to be one tool. It's going to classify all of our offenders to high, moderate, and low-risk offenders. And then that decision will be made based on some metrics that are easily identifiable. And there was a group that was hired to do the analytics on that, and they came back with 2 different assessment tools instead of one. And one has a 4-point scale, and one has a 5-point scale instead of 3, which is what SB 91 calls for. So there's challenges with that that's supposed to take effect, and we have to stay tuned to see what that's going to look like.
I'm hopeful that APD has a significant voice in those analytics and how these tools, I mean, you guys see it every day. I mean, look what you're dealing with in the last, couple of months. I hope you guys have a real impact in corrections. Let you be part of that.
If I can interrupt for just a second to answer your comment, ma'am. Captain Case is on the Criminal Justice Commission representing APD in the municipality, and that's, of course,
Well, the Criminal Justice Commission was all SB 91, but APDEA, the union, was not. And every police association in the state was not. So I get it. And there's good parts of SB 91. But frankly, I think the bad way is good, but that's not what we're here to debate. So I won't belittle it, but since everybody else is chiming in.
So the assessment comes to the commission.
Yeah.
So that's how I got access to the assessment, and then
And that's how you'll have access to input.
How about
correct. And then the commission makes the recommendation of what to do with this 2 scale. So we've got
Thank you.
we got
in the form of a question, if we can.
Well, you just answered my question.
You didn't have a question.
I did. I said, does APD have input in the DOC's assessment tool?
I think we found one at the end. We'll let you go on with your presentation. What you said, Mr. Bosco, let's be clear. A misdemeanor is a crime. It's punishable up to a year. It's not just a ticket. So there's infractions that are tickets. Misdemeanors, serious crime, drunk driving is a misdemeanor, but that you can stay in jail for up to a year on it until your 3rd one, and then it can be a felony. But anyway, and then felonies are overeaters. So most of what the Muni prosecutes are misdemeanor crimes. They're neither tickets nor felonies. Mr. Captain Case.
To work there.
I will say that has increased the workload, obviously, for Ms. Dino and her office, because we lower misdemeanors now it's a increased workload on the municipal prosecutor. So this is our calls for service, and the small areas there up to the right: weapon, violence offenses, drug, alcohol, property disorder, that are make up all the small slivers to that pie, and then 66% of it is other. And I just want to point out the other categories to you folks. If there are some things in the other category you'd like to see pulled out, because it's important to you or your constituents, some of those examples, traffic stops, general locates, follow-ups, welfare checks, fit into that other category. So, and I'm going to assume, unless you tell me different, that you guys like the separation by district in some of these areas.
Captain Keaton, I'm sorry.
No,
I was going to say, if this is going to go public, I think this is publicly available. I like it by district, but I also like it to be labeled with district a little bit, because most members of the public, they don't know what District 2 is or District 5 is.
If someone calls and said shots fired, is that listed under violent, or is that under other, or?
That's misconduct involving a weapon. So it's going to fall under the little green box.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And then we got arrest by assembly districts, and this is something that you guys we've kind of presented to you for the last 5 or 6 years. And I'll just take questions on the slides. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then here we're breaking it out by a month. Again, this slide is the 21 days of June, so that 641 number is obviously pretty low. am a little interested in what that number is going to come back to, because typically June is a pretty busy month. And, you know, if we settle on about 800, that's obviously lower than what we anticipate. So, again, that could be your potential nexus to SB 91. And so that's data that will pull if that number comes out of the ordinary. Stolen vehicles. Obviously, everybody knows that starting at the beginning of last year, we had a significant increase in stolen vehicles, and that increase has continued through 2017. A couple of good notes for, if I can maybe shed a little positive light. We do have a 92% recovery rate. Of that recovery rate, usually in the first 9 days are when the vehicles are recovered. Not to say that's not a gross inconvenience for our small business owners or people who are trying to come and go from work for those 9 days without a car, because it is. The other positive is that the damage on those vehicles that are being recovered is only about $193 a vehicle, so it's not like we're returning scrap metal to our community members when we get the vehicles back.
So that must be a real average from trash to 5 cars that just had no damage were found.
Right.
Yeah. And what are you finding on this? Is this joyriding? Is this to loot them, or is it to sell them?
So we have never had in Anchorage, and nor do we have now what some cities have, like chop shops, where they take the car, they repaint it, or they take it for parts and they redistribute to increase their wealth, so to speak. Our vehicles are typically a crime of opportunity, and the suspects that are committing these crimes are using it as a tool. Literally transportation. Usually that transportation is selling drugs or some other form of criminal activity. At the beginning of last year, we had our big stolen vehicle ring that was public when we made several arrests on it. What we found is that they were stealing cars, they were stashing them all over the city. They would then go to a house and burglarize it, leave a stolen car there and take the one out of the garage, and then they would drive down the street where they stashed a car and grab another one. You know,
So is transportation and camouflage, I mean, hiding from you more than it was making money off the car?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the money, they're not making money off the cars. They are not redistributing these cars. With that 92 recovery rate, the majority of those numbers is not the police find them,
Yeah.
we chase them, we catch them, we arrest them, we give the car back.
They
It
turn
is-
up.
They turn up. You know, our officers driving through parking lots, running plates to see if, you know, these vehicles that are parked in an odd manner are stolen, and sure enough they are, and then return to the owner.
I have a couple questions about the stolen vehicles. First, how are we tracking this year compared to last year? Like, how many stolen vehicles have we had so far this year?
So this is our 5-year trend, month to month is where we're at. I'll explain a little bit. So your 5-year trend is that white dotted line right in the middle. A mathematical analytics standard deviation is that big green strip in the middle, and meaning if our monthly data stays within that green range, even though it goes up or down, we're going to call that statistically stable. And if it rises above that green level, we're going to say that it's an increase over that 5-year trend. And so you can see that our orange bars there are stolen vehicles this year, and we were pretty much precedent setting last year with our stolen vehicles, and stolen vehicles continue to be on the rise.
Well above our long-term 5-year average or the deviation of it, just well outside of that.
That's correct.
Double.
I have a couple follow-up questions if I could, just they'll be quick. Secondly, have we done anything internally within APD to look at the ability of people to report stolen vehicles? I've raised this point at least twice before, that I had a constituent in my district who had a vehicle stolen, and when the dispatcher asked if you'd ever lent a vehicle, well, they had lent it, but it had been months and months and months earlier, and on Christmas Eve it was stolen. But since she had ever lent the vehicle out, she had to wait a week before APD would take a report on it. So have we
I
kind
am
of
aware of your concern and your constituents' concern, and I think we have, what was it, last meeting? It was one in the recent past where it's on our list of things to address.
I appreciate that. And lastly, I've heard this anecdotally and actually directly from somebody who was victimized with a stolen car. One of my biggest fears is, and I've known somebody this happened to, where they found their own vehicle, they blocked it in, they called for the police, Now, the last guy that I actually talked to, he said police were there within minutes. But others, my next door neighbor, for example, her daughter's car was stolen. She sat there for 45 minutes, and you know, I'm afraid of a confrontation because, you know, somebody's already obviously a criminal, they've already stolen a car, and now you have the public. What protocol does APD take when somebody finds their own stolen vehicle? I mean, because I think this is a serious potential public safety problem.
So it depends on what the circumstance they're finding the stolen vehicle, right? If they find their stolen vehicle parked in the parking lot of Walmart, it's obviously going to be a lower priority than three people are inside my vehicle and I'm driving down the road right now and following them. If that's the scenario, officer going to break and immediately respond to them and try to intervene. While dispatch on the phone is saying, hey, like, your safety's number one.
Yeah.
Don't get overly involved in this incident. It's just a car.
Yeah.
We don't want you getting hurt.
Okay, well, that helps me kind of differentiate how you guys respond.
Pete's next, so I have Mr. Train.
Is there a breakdown on the age of the vehicles that are being stolen, the older ones or newer ones? Does it even matter?
No, and you know, if you go back 15, 20 years ago, we could always say it's the Hondas and Toyotas that are getting stolen. It was a pretty easy thing. We don't see that trend. We are newer. I'm going to say it's newer cars. They're not taking piles of junk. Not to say that they won't, but I mean, they're definitely taking, you know, newer cars. But it is a target of opportunity. One of the bubbles there that I didn't talk about on the last slide was that a good percentage of the vehicles that are being stolen are, you know, keys left in the vehicle, doors unlocked, vehicle running. Now, I could probably give you a percentage on that. However, that would take hours and hours of work because that's not a searchable field. It's actually reading text narratives and finding what that would be. But it seems to be a reoccurring theme over and over again.
I just wondered if it was also the keys being left in the car, because I know in the wintertime we have an increase because people don't have car starters, leave their car running, getting to be right out, and the car's gone.
That is a significant part of the problem.
Those of us with crashing cars were celebrating that last statement. So, Mr. Rutherford.
So looking at this, so they're stealing cars so they can sell drugs. So they're selling more drugs so they need more cars?
And burglarizing.
I think the difference that we're seeing now is typically we would see a vehicle we would recover, we would actually catch them in a vehicle. They would have access to this vehicle for weeks and months driving a stolen vehicle. We're not seeing that as much anymore. We're seeing these cars get turned over at a very rapid rate right now, more so than we have in the past. And that's an anecdotal answer for you,
So there's like, on the criminals blog, they're saying, hey, here's how we do it now. Just steal it for a little while, go get another one. I mean, how do they know? So you're saying all these, is it 20 people stealing lots of cars, or is it hundreds, and they have new techniques on creating crimes, and they have a way of disseminating that information?
I can't answer that question for you right now.
Okay.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to, it looks like we're about to go into an extended discussion of Fairview. So before we do that, I was wondering if you could give us a little statistics on the homicides in Anchorage, because that was, I know it's a relatively small percentage of our total crime, but last year it was sort of the top line issue. We broke the previous record for a number of homicides in, I guess, let's say murders specifically. In Anchorage. So I was wondering how that trend is looking this year. Are we below where we were last year?
What are we about on pace?
I think it's
just slightly below.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think that we were about on pace with last year. Last year, if you recall, July saw a very large number of homicides just in that 1 month. I don't think we've seen a cluster like that yet, but we're definitely probably trending above that 5-year trend line that you see on, like, for example, this slide, if we put that homicide info here.
Me and Mr. Peterson, part of what I wanted to explore today and that we had, and the reason the fire department is here, is the possible link between opiate addiction and some of these kind of vehicle thefts and break-ins. And that'll be, I think, a theme that we'll be talking about for a while. So is that an aspect of the vehicle, or is it more the break-ins, or is it not? Is this?
I don't think that we've made a connection between opiates and vehicle theft at this point.
They're running around doing home break-ins in a fairly sophisticated manner. That's a smart way to use as transportation because you're
I wouldn't say the manner of breaking and committing burglaries is sophisticated. I mean, they're criminals.
I mean, I think, if I can interrupt this for a second, I think, Mr. Kraft, part of what you're saying, I mean, I think that that's sort of a theory, excuse me, that we've explored as well. We have that theory that, okay, we're seeing this increase, we're seeing an increase in, opioid
Property type crimes.
Right, property type crimes. We know sort of historically that drug crimes can be linked to property crimes, like you mentioned before, where people need the money or the goods to trade for their next fix of narcotics. So I think that we have explored that theory as well. I just don't think we have an answer yet that, yeah, we have data that can absolutely link the two together. But I think that we've had similar conjecture where we've considered whether or not that's
Well, Sean, as the numbers guy, I'm interested, and we've got members that's really interested. So if you can think of ways we might try to figure that out, whether that's a significant or not very significant part of what's going on in both vehicle thefts and break-ins. I'd appreciate any thoughts you have on that. Mr. Pierce.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and that was just along the same line that I was going to question. I thought maybe if we had a charge so many vehicle thefts, heroin overdoses, and break-ins by month, you might be able to see a trend. I just don't know.
So we can certainly take care of 1 and 3, and we'll team up with Chief LeBlanc on number 2, because I think they keep that data. Well, they have more contact.
Right.
But that's more of a response.
Thank you.
Try to stay out of the open up with
So 90% of stolen vehicles have been recovered. How many resulted in arrests?
That number we can't get for you. We ran that number probably 4 or 5 months ago. I don't remember it off the top of my head. It would obviously not up to date as to right now. But that is something that we can present with that sort of data with you on how many arrests that are.
What's your sense, if you have one, of whether it's a lot or a few?
Victoria, you know that off the top of your head our vehicle thefts and what our arrest rate is?
Anecdotally, I'd say a very small amount. A lot of them are found on the street and not in a specific person.
We'll get you the data, but I won't get a quantity or quality.
There's some things that we consider when we tackle that number. And one of the things that we can consider is we can maybe impact that number a little bit, but if we impact that number a little bit, one of the strategies would be then we probably are going to return that stolen recovered vehicle to the owner more rapidly, right? Because if we engage in more a little higher, more chases that are a little bit more higher risk to damage that property, right? So I mean, it's always this balancing act that we're trying to determine. I can tell you that in the town halls and community council meetings that I go to, one of the questions I have been starting to ask is, would you rather have your car returned to you and someone in handcuffs going to jail with your car being damaged, or would you rather just have your car returned to you? And I thought that was a very easy question, but I can tell you, a member of our public, they're like, I don't know. They're actually at that point where they're going, damaged car, someone in jail. I don't know where I'm at right now.
So if you have the person arrested or in jail, you might have a stronger tie to drug activity. That's presumed.
Yes, presumed.
No, I would add to that sentiment, and that in my neighborhood, I'm starting to hear people, this would be a good segue, saying, not only should we arrest them, but I'm going to shoot them because they're coming every night into my yard and I'm feeling afraid I'm going to move. Right? And I live in Fairview. People are literally afraid, so I'm afraid what's coming is some vigilante activities because people are done feeling unprotected in their homes.
I can tell you that we have a frontline concern with our officers on the street that protect the city 24 hours a day. That's exactly in line with that. I mean, we're seeing some frustration. It's been building now for well over a year, and we get questions all the time. I mean, I get them all the time myself. What's that line? How close can I get to that line? And we do our best to try to keep them as far away from that line. But those questions and those anecdotal scenarios seem to be increasing, and it's becoming a concern for our officers.
Do you have this?
Can I? You have follow-up.
Well, I was just going to ask if you have any indication that we are approaching vigilantism, or you had to diffuse these situations, or any indication, but I don't want to get
going to wrap up the stolen vehicle part, so that's fine. You're hearing that from your officers?
Correct.
Yeah. So is stolen vehicles going to be a focus? I know you've got a lot of areas that are calling for your attention, but do you have specific plans, Chief Dahl, on how to approach this? I mean, because the last year was big outside of our standard deviation, and then this year, particularly the first few months of this year, were just kind of off the charts.
Yeah, this year is even bigger, and it is something that we're concerned about. We are talking about ways to combat that. You know, one of the things, excuse me, that Captain Case mentioned was that, you know, one of the considerations, I mean, with stolen vehicles in particular, you know, if officers have observation of a vehicle, a stolen vehicle, so then reported stolen, it's being driven or operated, then the question is, you know, how do we recover that? And people that flee from us, typically, stolen vehicles tend to not stop when police officers turn their lights on. You know, what level of engagement are we going to commit to with something like that? Part of the discussion is, you know, should we evaluate our pursuit policy and the level at which we're willing to engage? And as Captain Cates mentioned, you know, that does tend to have an adverse effect on the actual property that's missing, right? The stolen car tends to get beat up if there's a police chase. But it also increases the risk to the officers in the community because, you know, police chases are not ideal. And there's a whole course of case law that says that you know, fault resides with the offender, but that doesn't change the outcomes if we have a bad outcome. So that's something that we're considering. But also, I think that, as you suggested a couple times, you know, is this wrapped up with illegal drug use and other property crimes, you know, breaking into homes, stuff like that? We think, at least anecdotally, that it could be. And so we do have, in process, we're developing some plans on how we would deal with that. You know, the police department's organized around several divisions. One of the divisions is the crime suppression division, which has an APT in this case. I feel like that is an appropriate structure to sort of place that responsibility. I would like to see, as we sort of finish sorting through our leadership change, obviously we had Deputy Chief Gilman retired recently as well. That left a vacancy that we'll be looking to fill here shortly. And so there'll be sort of a trickle-down effect. But as those leadership positions begin to cement, we're already engaged in discussions on, you know, what does that look like? How do we set up that particular division of the police department to be most successful in tackling just general street crime, which I think this is an example of what that is. You know, I met with the heads of all the federal agencies in town this morning. This was part of our discussion. They're very interested in being part of that solution. I think they can bring a lot of resources to the table, both in just in the field resource and also federal prosecution. People that are involved in, you know, more than just a one-off case could be candidates for federal prosecution. We're also, frankly, talking to the state how they might be able to participate. I don't think it would probably surprise anybody if, you know, we said that folks that are committing crimes in Anchorage tend to wander out to other parts of the state and commit crimes as well, especially here in the Matthew Valley. So they have an interest in that. So you know, the short answer is yes. We're looking at ways that we can set ourselves up to most effectively use the resources the department's been given over the last few years to, and as those are coming online, to have an effect on this, because we're concerned about it.
So we're going to continue to monitor it, and we'd be interested in your changes, efforts, focus on that. Do you have a follow-up?
I'm fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And so as we move off of that, so that will continue to ask you and watch these numbers and how you're approaching this differently, and then anything we can get on what's coming up next, which is after you guys, which is the opiate and epidemic, and how you can tell whether either of these, the car, the vehicle theft, or the home break-ins, are related to those. I'd be interested. And then you want to do a specific focus on Fairview, Chief Dahl?
Yes, sir. I thought that we would show this as an example. So, you know, we talk a lot about, well, we want to review the data that we have and try to identify issues and then come up with solutions to whatever that issue happens to be. And so Captain Case has an example that he's going to walk through that basically shows, you know, how we looked at the Fairview region in that area and what we were seeing and how we applied that. So I just thought that might be useful. I would like from time to time to bring these kinds of things forward to the committee just to show, hey, here's what we're looking at, here's how we're kind of working our way through the information that we have, and following up with an attempt at a solution. And I think Mr. Crouch and I have talked about this previously, where I'm an advocate of, if we identify an issue, let's come up with what we think is a solution. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, then let's try something else. And we're okay with making the attempt and maybe not having the outcome that we want, but using that information to come up with another plan and then implementing that. So,
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
What was the rationale for picking this section? I wasn't involved.
The rationale for picking this particular one is we happen to have an ongoing project that we're going to talk about, and we thought this was just happened to be a good example of something that's in progress. It's a project that Captain Case is going to explain in a little bit more detail, but it's basically with partnering with Brother Francis Shelter and Beans Cafe. They've been really good at responding to our feedback, working with us. I think it's a good example of partnering with entities in the community to address an issue and come up with a potential solution. So,
Quick follow-up. Is it fair to assume, recognizing the chart of arrests, that downtown is the number 2 district, but with half the population, it's really the number 1 area, that this is probably the number 1 of the number 1 area in town for hot spots?
We think this is one of the hotter spots in that Fairview area. I mean, and I don't think that's probably a surprise to anybody, and I suspect that Chief LeBlanc is going to add some information to that there's a lot of public safety responses to that location. But we want to show you that we're looking at that, the way that data looks to us when we review it, and I think you can probably see it, and it'll come up here, but there's a chart where it sort of looks pixelated, there's a bunch of squares of different colors. Well, that's really us kind of breaking the neighborhood down into grids so we can sort of identify basically which block has more activity than the other block, and try to figure out why, and then try to figure out how we can address that. So in this particular case, the Brother Francis Beans Cafe area showed up as a pretty hot location, right? There's a lot of public safety activity there. And so our community policing team has been working with those 2 entities to come up with solutions to reduce the public safety burden there and make sure that the residents that they're serving have adequate access to services. And we think that we're pointing in the right direction.
Thank you.
Captain Case?
So this is obviously Fairview, a breakdown on, for the most part, some more of our serious crimes with rapes, assaults, arsons, robberies. And kind of the traditional police model would be to look at these numbers and say, well, we've got high numbers of incidents, particularly arrests, burglaries, and robberies. And so the traditional police model is we're just throw some extra resources in there, maybe try to pick up the arrest numbers and hope that our problem will solve itself. For many reasons, that's not the most effective way of dealing with issues. So we're trying to go a step beyond just looking at the straight data and saying, hey, constituent, we've given you 1 extra patrol officer or 2 extra patrol officers. And so what we've done is the black line there is the Fairview Community Council District, and we've broken the entire city up into community council districts as well as those little square pixelated blocks, which is roughly 2 square blocks, block and a half. And that just allows us to put where the crimes are happening a little bit more specific. And I think the pain that I feel from the community when I talk to them is that everybody has a story, whether it's them directly or anecdotally, and their message is, hey, like, come to us, help. I want help in my area, and I want help in. Everybody wants that service, and unfortunately, that becomes challenging. And so, what we want to do is be very specific on how we target certain problems in Anchorage, and have a good rationale so that at least when we talk to the community, we can say, look, this is why we're investing time and resources. This is who we've teamed up with to help out, to try to fix this problem more than just on an arrest level alone. And so what we noticed there is that circle that's down there, that covers Bean Cafe as well as Brother Francis. It's red hot, and we have assaults and robberies that are very high in that particular area. And so one of the first questions that we asked is, who are our victims? We can all assume that it's going to be the homeless populations. We have Beans Cafe and Brother Francis, but we asked the question, we want to know the answer. And what we found in that area is that they are usually split pretty evenly between domestic violence assaults happening in that area and victimization within our homeless population. And so that's kind of contributing to those increased numbers. And so we look at that specific area, that 1,000 square foot block area, and you see we got 88 assaults. That becomes the primary issue in that area. And not only is that the primary issue, but as we break it down, 27% are Beans and Brother Francis campus,
Back
or
on
close there
the
to
last
it.
slide for a second. So what period of time is that? 88 assaults in what period of time? This year?
What's our breakdown? Through June 5th for this year.
Okay, sorry, and 16 rapes. And then 27% of the crime in the Fairview area occurred in that section around East?
27% of the assaults.
27% of all assaults that happen in Fairview occurred in that 1,000 square foot.
Fairview measured by the community council district? Yes. And half of them involved a weapon. I guess I was first thinking a gun, but it's more often knives?
Correct.
It's normally knives, blunt objects.
Wow, okay. Sorry for interrupting.
And so that bottom tier of this free pie chart, that information again comes from Victoria literally reading narratives to kind of get that information mined out. But that's kind of what we're committed to try to understand really what is at the root of the problem. So here, instead of tackling a huge problem like stolen vehicles all over the city are a problem, I'm going to be honest with it, finding the starting and ending point of that string is an overwhelming challenge, right? If other cities have figured out how to do that, I'd be more than welcome to adopt their methodology, but they haven't either. So with this methodology, at least we can say, okay, we realize that we've got a spike in crime. Probably that crime dates back years and years if we really want to pull that data. But that's obvious. It's a vulnerable population and it's a confined area. And policing a place versus policing people is a lot more productive in terms of results. So our CAP unit, along with Brother Francis, along with Beans, have kind of all teamed up. And so we're looking at the campus. We've, with high-def cameras, one of the issues that we have with kind of solving the crimes, if you will, when they happen on Brother Francis and Beans Cafe is when 6 people are involved and every one of them have some sort of drug or alcohol on board. The statements become not as coherent as we like them to be. The identification becomes problematic because they say, I don't have no idea who did this to me. And as we've seen in certain cases, when we look at video camera, when some of them are caught on video footage, like they were talking to the person for 3 hours and then that person hauled off and hit them, but our interview reveals, I have no idea who did this to me. So the cameras then become critically important. Similarly, right now there's a disconnect between the two entities down there on when we empty out Brother Francis for staying there for the night and when we feed them in Beans Cafe. And so what that causes is sometimes hours of congregation on the campus waiting for the next service to be provided, and bad things happen when we congregate with nothing else happening. And so whether it's they start drinking or using spice or other drugs and then fights and then all sorts of bad things happen. So now coordination of, hey, let's not flood the campus with folks and let them sit there for hours. Let's keep them in one location, provide that resource to them a little bit longer, and coordinate that when we're going to give them food at Beans, and then maybe we can cut down that a little bit as
So
well.
that's the kind of cooperation, I got John and then you, Christopher, that's the kind of cooperation you're getting from Beans and Brother Francis is talking about how we can change our practices in a way that helps
Right.
reduce it?
That's right.
And, go ahead.
I'm sorry, sir. And also, how it's the basic SEPTED principle, right? Like crime prevention through environmental design. So how can we change the physical part of the campuses or the sidewalks or the streets or fencing or whatever to help alleviate the issues that we're seeing?
I'll put me on after Sir John.
I just thought, I thought we were doing that. But I thought Beans and Brother Francis got together and they had this gap and we paid $500,000 last year.
This project is, you're correct. These conversations have, many of them have already taken, a lot of them taken place. Like this ball is rolling. I mean, we're going to see this continue to develop, and And so, yeah, I mean, I have got nothing but positive things to say about the cooperation between Beans Cafe, Brother Francis. It was just, let's all get on the same sheet of music and see if we can try to do something that reduces the victimization within this particular area. Additionally, right now it's a complete open campus concept. So what you have, for those of you who frequented Brother Francis or done any services down there, you'll know that there's a pocket of folks that are on that campus that have a lot of problems and bring a lot of drug and alcohol issues and mental illness and things like that. But you also have a very large population that use those services that use them for a period of time. They're homeless, they use it for a month, 2 months, 3 months. They follow all the rules, they're good people, right? And so when we have folks that are using drugs and alcohol, they end up coming onto the campus, and then they assault folks that are, for lack of a better way, minding their own business. And so closing the campus also potentially will help that, where some of the problem folks we can kind of keep on the outsides and reduce victims of those folks that are just trying to get services and get back on the feet.
Mr. Cox?
To that end, last night I went to a movie in Tecate, got out at 11:30 p.m. So I, as often as not, take a drive up 3rd Avenue just to get a sense of what's going on. Circle the block, counted 150 people at 11:30 at night on the street, right? And so the closed campus, open campus, I don't know that that's going to help so much at this point because of the attractive distance that's been created. That literally that's where people are and where they go, and hundreds of them are hanging out on the streets. And just from our perspective, it's 10 blocks, this area, it's 22 acres. That's all we're talking about. This density of issues is around. It's a very, very distinct area.
You were talking about the difficulty of policing it. It's a nightmare to prosecute because you're getting those statements and they're in various situations, but then I can't find them again, right? Then the witness 2 months later.
Or the victim.
Yeah, witness, victim. There was a series of really brutal assaults at some of the camps that were just tremendously hard to get tried, right? And eventually I had enough time on that guy that I suspended a lot and said the restriction is you can't go back to the camps. So then all you have to do is find them there and put in all that. Really difficult for the witnesses.
And then sometimes the witnesses were heavily sedated or drinking or whatever, so their testimony might not be as reliable as some other witnesses.
That's right. Not very reliable testimony and hard to get them in the courtroom at all. Appreciate the presentation. We'll continue to be interested in how you focus on particular districts, how you focus on issues like automobile and coffee shop in particular. And hopefully we can talk next time about some of the home break-ins and what we might do there. Mr. Trainer.
Chief, I got a question for you. You received a letter on the 30th of June from OMB, Lance Wilbur.
Correct.
As you're doing your 2018 budget to cut back 5%. 5% doesn't tell me how much money we're dealing with. What I want from you is, as you do your 2018 budget, what that actually means in dollars and impact us this. Because quite frankly, right now, I'll cut everything else off rather than first responders. And I'll have the same question for the chief. Because right now, the number one issue is public safety in this town. So I don't want to hear from any administration. This is the last one. We're going to cut anything to first responders. I know last year we got into a fight on the assembly. I think they wanted to cut out your the vests. They were going to cut back the money on the vests. We stopped that from happening. So as you're projecting the budget, you're going to have to do what they ask you. But I want to know in dollars and programs what 5% really means to the public.
We're preparing that now.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up on a question Captain Hitzer asked earlier in this presentation. I think it would be a helpful measure to see how many of these arrests that you're making are basically re-arrests. People that you are seeing multiple times. I think that's a helpful measure or a helpful part of the story. So if you said you could look at that number, that would be helpful. I don't know what we'll do about it, but frankly, it'll tell us if we have a lot of different people committing different crimes, or if it's kind of a same kind of core group of the same people.
Well, that ties into the impact of SB 91, right? We actually didn't have the infrastructure in place, not just within the police department, but in the entire state, to say, okay, how are we really going to measure that?
already looking at it. So as you get that information, I'm not saying like next week or next month, but I think it is an important part of the conversation because, I mean, it's a huge question. Do you have 400 arrests, or you have 400 new criminals, or do you really have 200 that are committing the majority of the crimes?
Any other assembly questions or comments?
I just say thank you for my neighbors. This is super, super important to us. I'm losing neighbors because of this issue. And it's sad. People I've lived next to for 15 years. They're leaving. So you can see those blocks, 50 of them that are sacrificed to this use. You gotta stop it. Your health is inevitable.
Congratulations, Chief Dahl, and we'll keep your feet to the fire on these and other issues. We almost exactly an hour in. We have another hour, so the fire department has enough time to tell us about both spice and opiate calls. That's a separate package for the members. And we have Eric, how do you say your last name? Sherman. He didn't spell his first name right. He didn't spell his last name however he wants. Is Eric going to do the presentation?
Yes, he will go ahead, Mr. Chairman, and give the overview of the fire department at the spice and heroin with his charts. Just wanted to give a couple brief comments about year-to-date efforts. Of course, we're still dealing somewhat with the defeat of Proposition 2, where we were going to add 2 ambulances, which would have put us into a position where we would have been able to staff additional ambulances with regular staffing. Up until yesterday, we had to staff those ambulances which are needed, despite the vote. The vote didn't eliminate the need for the ambulances, so we're continuing to staff those ambulances. We're doing that on overtime, but thankfully to the IAFF and your efforts last night, passing the new contract, the IAF has agreed to extend the side letter with us through the end of this year, so we have more time to put together a game plan of how we will permanently staff 2 additional ambulances. We'll reduce the staffing on engines and trucks from 8 4-packs to 5 4-packs, which will give us 3 extra bodies per day to staff those ambulances, and then we have to make up the others. So thank you for your efforts last night, and thank you to the union for working with the mayor and the manager to enter into a new 3-year contract. We did say, though, that despite our best administrative efforts, because of the failure of the proposition and costs associated with that, if we had to make operational changes, we would do. And we have made one operational change where we've taken one apparatus out of service on a day-to-day basis, and that's Tender 9, located at Station 9 in South Anchorage. Of course, we're very, very watchful of the need for that tender, and if it does become necessary for some operational event, we will definitely find an engineer to staff it. But we have 5 tenders, full-time service, so only one of those 5 tenders right now is out of service per day.
Tell everybody what a tender is.
A tender is a portable water tank. Most of Anchorage is hydrated, but of course the hillside and parts of East Anchorage are not. So these tenders carry the water, and they do a ballet, if you will, and 3 tenders can keep a fire scene fully supplied with water. So just a quick overview there, and if you recall, when we get into the spice and the heroin responses, the EMS side of the house is being taxed extremely heavily. So that's why we're maintaining the 2 ambulances that the voters actually said we don't care to fund. Wrong answer. And you will also recall that the last ambulance that we did add was in 2010, and that was Medic 7. Since that time, we have increased transports within the city of Anchorage by 38% over that 6-year period with no additional ambulances. So that problem will stay with us, and we'll have to continue to figure out ways to deal with it. But the first slide that Assistant Chief Schuneman has gives you a demonstration of of the crisis that we're facing with SPICE and with heroin.
So, Mr. Chair, what I'll do is I'll kind of break the two substances apart because one, at least for AFP, we are not seeing a correlation between the abuse of the SPICE and abuse of heroin and fentanyl.
It's not necessarily a gateway drug to heroin. They're different populations.
Totally different populations affecting. When you look at the handouts and kind of going back a little bit of historical perspective with SPICE, which is synthetic cannabinoids, again, that's just a synthetic version. It's basically a chemical that does have some physiological effects similar to THC or marijuana, but it's not the same thing. It's a chemical. It's created in the lab. With SPICE, as we call it here in different cities, it's known as K2, Bush, other names like that. When we first started seeing it in the community, it was probably about 2010. That's when at least AFD and I think APD as well became aware of it coming in the community. But over the years, up until 2015, it was just kind of looking after on noise.
Does it have a different high? Is it cheaper? What's the attraction versus?
It's cheaper. You can order it online. You can get it through the mail. And it depends on what kind of chemical structure that particular cannabinoid is, on whether or not kind of the physiological effects to it. So going in 2015 in the summer, right around July, that's when we started seeing just an increased number of opioids that were related to SPICE, and this was something we've never seen in the previous 5 years. So 2015 through about, that was July into June of 2016, we saw a tremendous amount. It turned out in that time period to be 12 to 1,300 patient transports were generated just off SPICE within a year's time. And you can see it's, I believe it's on one of the second or third slides there. That goes back to 2015. I'm sorry.
Well, let's go through them. But Chief, sort of, you're used to reading these on the walls of stations. Translate for us what this means in terms of what's going on in Station 2. Either one of you.
Sure. So on the first slide there, this was just a picture of basically our ABL system.
Mm-hmm.
These were 2 responses this month to SPICE overdoses. We don't see SPICE in one particular part of town in the Fairview area. We do see 1 or 2 patients at a time, but something that is new for AFP since 2015 was multiple patients that are overdosing. So these 2 are examples, one on the 1st, one on the 10th, where there was up to 5, 6 patients overdosing on SPICE. And when I say overdosing, seizure-like activity, unconscious, difficulty breathing. So the different callers just you can ignore that, but these are apparatus that are responding to that call.
Medic 4, Medic 5, Medic 7 are all out. Medic, I don't know, what's Medic 82?
82 is the number of BLS ambulances. So this particular call had 5 ambulances respond, as well as some fire apparatus and command elements to help run the scene there. So this particular call, we had transported 5 patients. Status 1 is a critical, life-threatening condition. Status 2 is potential. Status 3 are stable. So we had 5 patients, 3 being in the critical unstable conditions. And on the 10th, kind of the same deal. We had 4 patients. 2 of them were critical, and 2 were unstable.
At the same time, you're out on those calls.
That is 1 call. So there may be other SPICE calls going on, and on the 10th there were some other SPICE-related overdoses in the downtown area that we're responding to. So when we get multiple overdoses, this is very taxing to the system. Our dispatchers are trained in just with our computer-aided dispatch and emergency medical dispatch protocols. We do a really good job of triaging some other 911 calls within the city. They're handled appropriately. We have EMTs, paramedics on all of our apparatus. If anything, there's a little blame, get an ambulance there when we're faced with these, as we call them, multi-victim incidents. It was not uncommon in the summer, fall of 2015 to have SPICE incidents with 7 to 8 to 10 patients on the scene. So this is taxing, and it kind of waned by summer, probably about June. We started, it was decreasing, it was not becoming, I would say, a system issue for us. But in the last 3 months, we were starting to see an uptick. This is June especially, and July so far, we're on track to possibly mirror again 2015 and 16.
Yeah, so those, 1 second, so those 2 slides, so people, it's go through the handout, but after the first page, suspected spice up from January to July, from the 20s to the 50s, and then this longer-term history, which I appreciate to give the context. It really, John, that you can see that fall of 15 spike into the 400s. That was sort of the height of that epidemic. It looked like it settled down, and now it's trending back up.
Correct.
So, Mr. Constant and Mr. Willis.
Yeah, so you just breezed through something I think that's super important, and I want to keep hearing this until it's not a problem. You just said it's not. It wasn't uncommon then in that summertime where you would have 6, 7, or 8 ambulances on spice calls at the same time. What does that mean to the city?
So in the Anchorage Bowl, we have a total of 10 ambulances. We have 1 ambulance in the River Fire Station 11. So that's 11 ambulances on duty. One thing to take into consideration with Anchorage, Sun Lake, major metropolitan, those size cities in the rest of the country, we don't have mutual aid resources available.
No backup from some nearby county or city or whatever.
We have, at times, we pull in an ambulance if Durwood Fire Department has anyone available to shoot Jack. We can use Jayberry Fire Department. That's 1 or 2 ambulances. Our backup from that is Matsu Borough, and we have no idea what they can provide just depending on their call volume. So when you look at multi-victim incidents and overdoses, it's kind of unique. The spice outbreaks in other cities do occur where they see multiple patients, but I think this, from what our studies with the section of epidemiology and research that we've done over the past couple of years, we're definitely unique here in Anchorage, and it does tax the system. I'll get into it later, but when you have heroin and fentanyl, that's a potential lockdown for major issues.
Okay, we'll get to that,
Just
Mr.
so
Weldon.
it's super clear, what that means is there are days when there are 0 ambulances available for anywhere in the whole municipality because they're all picking up bodies on the street up in North Fairview. And then while we have the best results for fire department, for heart issues and other issues, you're going to get an engine with qualified medical professionals with no transport for your grandmother or your child in this town.
And what's important to remember when you look at these screenshots, this is just a screenshot of that one incident. It could be 6 or 7 other responses that we're responding to, which is exactly to your point. The city is depleted of ambulances.
John and Pete, so Mr. Weldon.
I thought we solved this problem by making spice illegal. And then we had this steep decline and everything was good. So it didn't work anymore? I mean, it did some.
This uptick is an anomaly. As you can see from the long chart, we were trending down probably 3%-ish of our business. At one point, it was well over 20% in the fall of 2015. And we did see a decrease after the action was taken by the Assembly. But this has basically been a 60-day phenomenon.
Yeah.
And we don't understand why.
When was spice broadly made illegal?
November 2015.
Right as that spike comes down. But now it's turning back up. Hold on, so we'll go in order. How about that? Mr. Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, how long are the ambulances on these calls if you got 5 or 6 ambulances going to transport these patients?
If you look at from the time of calls or response time, attending the patient on scene, packaging the patient, treating, transporting to the hospital, cleanup, reporting. In the Anchorage Bowl, a typical transport is probably about 1 to 2 hours of time. So that's just the way it is. So 5 there, that's about 10 hours worth of time on task.
Mr. Bosky, or did you have a follow-up?
That's good. Thank you.
I think you'll probably agree with this, but it wasn't just the fact that the Assembly made spice illegal. It was the fact that we also bolstered the CSP transportability and added extra CSP vans, because what was happening was AFE, they would have a 4-man engine company because there were no ambulances, sitting on a man-down call, potentially spice, for an hour waiting for an ambulance. And there were times over a 4-month period that AFD gave me the demographics for. There were multiple times throughout the city that all resources were, even reserve rigs were being used. So it's an important, and the reason I say this is you know, this is where we go to AFB's guidance too, sometimes is when they need another resource that maybe we don't think about as a public safety resource like CSP vans. Now it's ASP. Sometimes that really does help their mission because it frees them up to do the real serious medical calls and fire calls. I mean, have you guys seen any impact?
Oh, absolutely, and actually with kind of a side note with ASP and on the July 1st call, a good example of this, when Mr. Time Chief reported to me, is it wasn't just the 5 spice overdoses. There was an upwards of a dozen or more inebriated individuals that the fire department had to request ASP to handle as well, to take over the safety center.
So maybe some of that drop is related to not only the action you took in getting it off the shelves, but maybe also the implementation of where you guys can divert to ASP.
And we have a great partnership with ASP. In 2013, Anchorage Fire Department took over responsibility of dispatching ASP, and their vans right now are electronically synced with our dispatch, so we know where they are, GPS, et cetera. So we have a great partnership with them, and they're extremely helpful. But when we added those 30,000 calls a year, just associated with ASP, we didn't add any dispatches either.
Ms. LaFrance?
I think you mentioned this, but in terms of location, where are the responses primarily occurring? In the second part of my question would be demographics concerning victims. Do you have that?
Sure,
in terms of ages?
My apologies, I did include a screenshot of, we kind of track everything by map grids, and Captain Cates, his map up there on the Fairview area, with the Brother Francis Beans and those 2 to 3 block areas, what we call grid 1232. One thing that is different now that I'm seeing in terms of location versus 2015-16 is the amount of transports coming out of that area of Fairview right now is about 70%.
Of what?
Of the spice is in the Brother Francis Beans, Carla, Gamble areas. Before in 2015-16 it was in the low 60s. We saw a lot more of the spice downtown, BAC, Town Square Park, other parts of the downtown area. This spring and into summer, we're seeing it primarily down in Brother Francis Beans area. One thing I'll add is with spice, that is different in Anchorage and other communities, is it's predominantly in, well, we don't track homeless populations. The study we did with the section of epidemiology did note it's a high level of homeless public neighborhood population that's affected by it. What we don't see here, or at least the fire department isn't responding to, is in the general population, teenage age groups, we're not seeing it. Occasionally we do, but nothing like, say, other cities do, where they'll see the homeless population as well as the high school population and general population. We don't have that here.
Pete, I got you coming, but just to be clear on that, so I know your job is to treat and categorizing them for epidemiological purposes is low on your priority list, but when you did that one sub-study, it was half, it was 75% of the spice calls were homeless population? What kind of order of magnitude?
I don't remember off the top of my head what we came up with, but it was, I would say, well over 60%.
I'd like to see it, but okay, that gives me good. Pete and then Chris.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, we, at the Anchorage Assembly level, did pass laws to outlaw spice. And so it was effective. You can see how the chart, the number went down dramatically. But the problem is the federal government has not followed suit. And so something that Anchorage citizens could do would be to write their congressional delegation and demand that, they make a federal law against spice so that people cannot buy the stuff online and get it. It's legal federally, but it's not legal locally. And so there's a crack in the armor there, and we need some help from Congress to fix that.
And one of the difficulties with it, and you'll see that too with the fentanyl, the analogs of fentanyl, is these are all synthetic drugs, and it's very easy for a chemist to change this whole part of the chemical structure. So, say, spice A may be illegal in the U.S., but they change the whole chemical and it isn't anymore. The other thing unique is what we're seeing now, whatever version of spice is in town right now seems to be different than what we had a year and a half, 2 years ago. 9 or 11 different chemical variations of spice in those that were tested for. So it's very difficult to, the federal government, state government, local governments always playing catch up on this.
I'm Kristen enforced, but it's my understanding from reading books that it's very hard to overdose on marijuana. How is it so easy to overdose on spice if it's a synthetic derivative? Like what causes that danger?
Again, and that's why when they call it synthetic cannabinoid, it probably wasn't a really good term for it. Because THC and marijuana and spice are totally different chemical structures. So
Really not.
the effects on the body are totally different.
And
Yeah, Kristen enforced.
friends who are knowledgeable about matters in the street would say it's the difference between something that's grown and something they call bathtub smash. You know, it's just whatever somebody put in the bathtub and made a mix out of and put out, and someone said, I'm going to buy it. That's a different issue. Question is both for the chief of police and for the battalion chief. Nancy, the homeless coordinator, worked pretty hard to put a social worker on with the CAP team with the intent of providing immediate connection to services available. That derived from some homework that I did with Nancy that in San Francisco, the #1 used fire truck, I think, in America, an engine, was used to respond very much the same as the calls that we see here, not just spice, but overall this problem. Have you guys had any contemplation about kind of matching what they're doing in places at work, bringing social workers into your units to help engage people as, you know, you're dealing with the traumas that are happening? Because that's something that I think could work, or may be working.
Yeah, there's a concept of community paramedicine within the state. Regulatory-wise, it doesn't exist at this time. It's something we've been in discussions and have been talking with Catholic Social Services and others about heading down that road eventually. But again, it's all staffing dependent too on our end. But you know, getting these folks into treatment, I couldn't tell you if we have specific treatment programs for spice up here. I know they exist elsewhere, but I'm not aware of anything here in Anchorage.
From our perspective, and having the, you know, the ability to have that person go out in the field with the CAP team, make face-to-face contact with potential clients, I think we don't have any real data on that yet because it hasn't been going for a real long time, but I think anecdotally the information is that there's been a positive effect. I mean, you are connecting resources with people who need them, you know, in a one-on-one kind of way. So we're curious to see how that plays out, but we're happy to have that opportunity inside the cabinet.
Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I was ask you, Chief, but also Chief Dahl, if you have any, have any of your employees had actual conversations with these transports? I mean, the people who are being transported, ask them, what is going on? What is causing this uptake? So what evidence do we have? Is it a new dealer in town? Is it a new batch? Is it because they're replacing something like the price of marijuana has gone up? I mean, what is it that what evidence do you have of what is driving this? What do they say?
This year, nothing in particular that's trickled up to me. I don't know what your office is saying.
I'm in essentially the same boat. Our officers may have been talking to people. We've got a pretty heavy officer presence during these events. I just don't know what the information is.
We're trying to feel towards that answer, right? But how do we deal with it? How do we help you deal with it? But part of that, the answering that question is figuring out what is causing it, right? What causes it to explode now? If there's no more questions, I'd like to get back to the presentation of, after those first 2 pages, spice transports by day of the week.
Yeah, in April it was. I did meet with Lisa Saunders, State Health Department. We had a spice meeting at the Health Department. And one of the things we did talk about is working with epidemiology in the past, we didn't look at time of day or day of the week. And it's going back to the campus activities, like Deputy Jason, the chief mentioned. The dealers, most of the spice overdoses occurring when people are going around out there. So I started tracking that a little bit. I mean, it's just for this year. If you looked at the 2 incidents we had, one was a Saturday and one was another day of the week. So unlike, say, maybe with heroin that kind of follows on patterns of paychecks, with the spice, I haven't really found any pattern, and even the time of days has been changing. Just I've been watching the hours of the day we're seeing it. And then 2 weeks ago, after that, we started seeing these large incidents too, so. And the last slide on spice is repeat transports. So these are unique individuals who transported more than one time for spice use.
One person transported 10 times, 3 people transported 7 times.
Now, to put this in perspective, in 2015 and 2016, we had multiple patients that were transported over 20 times in a 6-month period. So, and you can see there's 142 patients who only transported once.
Say that again, you said multiple people transported more than 20 times?
20 times.
And so that was last year?
That was the last outbreak.
Okay, I'm not this one. Okay.
We're actually picking up patients who still have the hospital wristband on.
That goes to your question, Mr. Boskin. So it's a mix of some people who are doing it once and a core that are doing it a whole lot of liars. Doing it once, they're probably doing it for one transport.
One of the sidebar issues, we put out a protocol message yesterday for our responses to this particular area because of the increasing threats to our first responders by people that frequent that particular area. We now have a response and parking plan to protect the firefighters as well as to protect our apparatus from damage.
From getting hit by cars?
Abused by the others who are there, who want to fight with the firefighters, who want to take things off of the fire apparatus.
Any other questions on spice before we move to heroin? We're done with spice and we have to try heroin.
For now.
For now.
So with heroin, it's kind of the same thing. Up until recently, and specifically recently, I mean towards the end of April, nothing had really trickled up to me from our EMTs and paramedics on the amount of heroin overdoses we had been seeing. And the way I kind of track this is it's looking at our use of naloxone, which is opioid antagonist medication. So I actually went back to the beginning of 2016 out of curiosity and looked at all of our naloxone administrations and how many of those patient care reports were reflective of heroin overdoses.
Let's do that slide first. The first one gives us the context. So it's the last slide.
So when you look at the blue line is naloxone use per month. Purplish is the suspected heroin overdoses where we had used naloxone to reverse.
But to get the time frame on, so it starts January going from 15 to 16.
16, it starts January 2016 through.
So this is the flip side of the spike. Where spice, we had a big spike and we're on the downside of it. This is a trend line, or not a trend line, it's kind of stable, low level, and then a spike we're either in or just in.
Yeah, so when I've looked at our use of naloxone over the years, the amount we have to purchase for our supplies, it's always been very stable. What happened in October and November of last year, I'm not quite sure, unless if this was maybe, you might know if this was the introduction of fentanyl into the community, but definitely for certain, towards the end of April and then all of May, we saw just something that's in my 28 years here and talking to guys in the department in around 35 years they've never seen with heroin. So it's definitely reflective of fentanyl, just even with the patients that had been saying after the reverse with naloxone that they'd used the same dose, but something was different this time.
I have John and Dick, but so yeah, March you have what looks like 3 suspected heroin overdoses, and by May you have almost, well, you're 55. Yeah, Mr. Webb.
I'm kind of confused. So, you use naloxone more often than you suspected a heroin overdose?
Because we use, you have to remember to intentional and unintentional opioid prescription medication overdoses. So there's a lot more uses for naloxone than just heroin. So maybe, so that's why it's for opioids or potential opioid overdoses. So our naloxone use would be higher than what fentanyl heroin is, but you can just see on that graph that they're starting to narrow. So there's been a trend too also in prescription medications that's gone down.
So hidden good news in that.
So heroin overdose doesn't mean they died. It just means they went to the hospital and recovered there.
It was just we had to use the actual true number of patients that overdose on heroin is going to be higher than that. But these were the most critical where we had to use naloxone.
mine lives down in Salt Lake area, a lot here down there. They've got naloxone for the libraries now. Some of the library personnel are trained how to use it because they have so many people that are going to the library and they're on opiate. So my question, we adopted that type of policy here, so if somebody is on opiate and crashing and heroin at the library, they could give them naloxone and bring them out.
So the Alaska Project Hope through the State Public Health, this is the 5-year harm reduction grant, primarily has the overdose rescue response kits, and that includes 2 Narcan nasal sprays. So a part of that, and granted, it's really just one individual at the state that's been spearheading this and doing the training. It has come into Anchorage now where they're doing with community groups that are offering the kits. Beans Cafe is one. They will do some training and hand them out there. Covenant House, 4A's, and Real About Addiction are the other ones, the other sites that distribute these kits. Some cities have put them, they're literally talking about putting them into wall-mounted AEDs, putting them on street corners. It just really depends on how significant it is within the community. What I don't know is, I would compare ourselves to Vancouver, BC, because that's the closest city that has a heroin fentanyl epidemic, but far beyond anything we've ever experienced.
Is it, this is, theirs is a bigger problem?
Much bigger. They had up to 1,000 deaths in British Columbia last year that were related. Vancouver alone was 270 to 300. If you ever have some time to do some research on it, because they have been so overwhelmed, they have a MASH unit downtown Vancouver just to treat heroin overdoses. But ours dropped once fentanyl got into Vancouver and BC. It stayed there. It became a problem. And my big concern is, should we see something like there here and have spice as well, like we're seeing, that would be overwhelming for us. We'll be in disaster mode at the fire department.
So the library getting these kids in so they can, I know that you put them in the person's nose, how they getting at least one person in there, so in case we have somebody that crashes on the drugs, they can try and get them stable, and they call you guys, you call them out of there.
I'm not aware of what other city departments are doing.
I'll check into that, thank you.
I have Mr. Dunbar and then Ms. Kowalski, Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who that one person at the state you mentioned.
Andy Jones.
What's that?
Andy Jones.
Andy Jones, okay. I know when I was working in Juneau that Senator Johnny Ellis and his chief of staff, Amory Lake, who also worked for us for a little while, were pushing really hard on this issue about getting this treatment out, and I really appreciate the work they did. I guess my short question is, do you have enough? And is there more that we on the Assembly can do to get you the resources you need in terms of this particular drug? Is it? Do you guys have enough? Should we get it to a different department, or what do you?
So at least with naloxone, I mean, we've had a whole other meeting on the national crisis of prescription medications and availability, but naloxone has been very stable. Up until this year, we were spending about $12,000 a year on naloxone. We're already at 14 this year. The basic price of it is stayed stable, and the availability has been stable, so we're good. I mean, we use a different form of naloxone than the nasal spray that's in these rescue kits, and those are generally about $76 a dose. Ours run about 30. But at least at this point, our supplies are fine, our supply chain is intact. I don't know for a fact, and I haven't heard from the state anything different, but the amount of these naloxone rescue kits out in the community may be one reason why we've seen a drop in our responses, but I'm just not sure.
And then, so I wanted to get that context for the discussion. I guess going back to the 2 slides then before it, really, the penultimate one is just rolling out January to May. What happened in May? Do you have any idea, Eric? Kind of answer? Anybody? Yeah.
I think what Chief Schumann was saying regarding the addition of fentanyl to some of the heroin that we're seeing on the street, I have some information from the police department that suggests that we are starting to see fentanyl on the street here. And so I think that could be an issue. I don't know that we've specifically tested any of the drugs that we've recovered from overdose scenes from presence of fentanyl. But I know that some of our units that are working drug cases have come across what they believe is fentanyl as part of their seizures. I think that if you look outside Alaska nationally, when other communities have seen a rise in sudden heroin overdoses, typically as they dig into it kind of down the road, they find that it's due to a mix of fentanyl or something similar to that. There's fentanyl and what's the next level of those out?
Carfentanil.
Yeah, carfentanil. And so that tends to get mixed into the heroin, and then you see a big rise in overdoses and deaths. So I don't have specific information, but I think anecdotally that tends to sort of be supported by some of the things that we're seeing.
And a lot of fentanyl is produced overseas, comes across the border, and like with spice, fentanyl now is, they're saying multiple different analogs, versions of it. So other cities and states will see actual deaths from overdoses. But again, the government's kind of behind the ball trying to figure out what the compound is they're dealing with.
Further assembly questions or comments? If not, then I'll wrap things up. This is going to be a continuing inquiry, so I know you're busy saving lives and putting out fires, and you're busy putting away bad guys, and we want you doing that mainly rather than data crunching. But it's important for at least me and I think other members to try and figure out what's causing it on your end, and that's a data question. And you, plus Virginia in the back there, seem to have done a lot of work on this. Whether there is, in fact, a connection between some of these spikes we see at the AFB level and some of the activity that we've been seeing on your end, or whether there's some other explanation, because it leads to different criminal justice conclusions. If it's an addiction issue, we have a different method we think works better than if it's a gang who moved into town. Treatment isn't going to be as significant an option. Any old business to bring up? Any audience member who would like to testify or participate?
Just a question for the chair. Can we get these electronically?
Yeah, I have them, and so I will get them to assembly staff. I think they're in color. My printer wasn't, but anyway, I have them. Yes?
They're available on the website for the Public Safety Commission.
Oh, already, the two I sent you. Good, okay. So they're already there. I already did that. Yeah, it's very efficient. Then if there's nothing else, this is adjourned.